Right. Hello, everyone. My name is Noor. I'm a PhD student at DPU, and I'm going to be your host for today. So yes, today I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Caroline Moser, who we were joking is the newest or one of the newest members of staff at the DPU. But of course, as you're going to hear, her journey actually starts some 40 years ago or over at the DPU. So suggesting that she's new is not exactly true. However, she has been recently appointed as an honorary professor at the DPU, and that's why we're making that joke. Anyway, I don't want to give too much away about her professional journey because I want her to get a chance to say it, but she's obviously started at the DPU as a lecturer over 40 years ago, actually as one of, or the only woman lecturer at the time, which is amazing. And then she's also held professional academic positions at the LSE and at the University of Manchester. She's worked at some amazing international organizations as well, Ford Foundation and the World Bank, as well as some think tanks such as the Brookings Institute. And of course, I don't know if some of you are familiar, but she's done some fantastic work, a 40-year longitudinal study in Ecuador, which is really fascinating. And recently, actually, she took a job as a camera woman as part of that project, 40-year project. But anyway, you know what? You're not here to listen to me, so I'll let her tell you all these stories. So Caroline, why don't we start over 40 years ago at the DPU, only women lecturer?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you so much for joining, and thank you very much for actually that I can see your faces. I do. We all do a lot of webinars nowadays, and actually, I find it really disconcerting if I'm just talking to black faces names. So I do appreciate it. I know it means you can't. If you want to slope off and have a coffee, or you want to leave the room, I don't mind at all. It's just great to actually see people. For me, you know, I've been, as Noor was saying, I've been a lecturer and I've been a practitioner, and I've worked and done tons and tons of training in my life and capacity building. So I really like seeing and working with people, and the webinar, we're having to learn how to do it in this way. So yeah, I started at the DPU. Can you believe it, with a 6-week contract. Michael Safier invited me because I just finished my PhD, which was on urban market sellers in Bogota. I'm a social anthropologist, and I sat in the markets in the freezing cold for a year, and I wrote this PhD about what's now called the informal economy. We used to call it the informal sector. And Michael, who was a real visionary at the DPU, he predates many of you. He just thought, God, this is a really interesting thing. Why don't we hire her? I was so grateful to get a job. I mean, there I was, I just got a PhD, I had 2 kids, where was I going to get work? So I said, sure, 6-week contract. Anyway, and I did that job, and out of that, a year later or so on, I was hired, and as Noor says, I was the first. There had been a woman before me, but it was a very male outfit. There were 15 members of staff, much smaller, totally different from how it is now, and I was the only woman, and I was the sort of like the soft sociologist, anthropologist, because the others were all architects and planners. Nigel Harris was an economist, so I was the sort of soft person who did all the stuff, and that's how I began at the DPU. And I started there, I think, in 78. I don't know, but what happened was that the DPU in those days actually really survived on its short courses. Everybody was out there doing short courses, training mid-career practitioners, much fewer master's programs, and much less academic than it is now. It was a very different institution. And I used to get called in on a Friday afternoon for a sort of short course on land use planning or transport planning or whatever it was, because they'd say, oh my God, women in development, we must do something. Friday afternoon, and all the guys would think, oh my God, my wife, and they'd all disappear and go shopping. So there I was doing a one-off slot on women in development, and that's where gender planning began, because I realized that if I was going to be taken seriously by these guys, we had to really invent gender as a planning discipline in its own right, and not just be an add-on to what everybody else was doing. So that's how I started on gender planning at the DPU. No.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think it's not just that you started on gender planning at the DPU, you started gender planning at the DPU, which I do, it's very important to kind of make that distinction, because it's, I don't underestimate what you did at the time. It's fantastic. But then you decided to leave and to make a move to the World Bank. So, I mean, I can't imagine that was very popular. I don't think even today,
Well,
that's probably not the most popular decision, but yeah.
it cuts a lot into, yeah, I did invent it. Karen was my administrative assistant. Can you imagine? Karen Levy at the time. There was me and there was her. And these guys used to say, what are you doing? But the point about it was that it was very popular and very successful. And at the time, the DPU needed money. So the great opportunity when you're thinking, how do you do things and invent things and where you do them, is that actually the DPU provided this crazy opportunity, because as long as I brought in money, they didn't mind what I did. So anyway, I did that. And then I went to the LSE and I found the LSE just very stultifying. It didn't have the creativity of the DPU. It was a very big, traditional academic, much more academic than DPU. And then so this guy invited me to go to the World Bank. And it was the time of macroeconomic structural adjustment, when everybody was beginning to look at what's happening to the poor. And I'd done a sort of quick and dirty return visit to this community in Guayaquil where I'd worked before. And so he invited me to go there. And was it a good idea? Well, I certainly learned a lot, but it was tough. It was very, very tough. It was tough because everybody that I knew thought this was a terrible decision, because in those days, I don't know what it's like now, the World Bank was this pariah. I mean, nobody went to the World Bank. Everybody criticized it. And all the gender people who'd become my mates, in the NGO world, we did all this training with all these NGOs, sort of thought I was a total traitor. I mean, really, really. When I was at the bank, I went and did a session in Nicaragua, and honestly, if they'd had stones, they could have got me out the room. But when it came to talking to the Prime Minister Chamorro of the country, Violeta Chamorro, I was asked to do it. And that's the irony of working in these types of institutions. So yeah, it was very tough. And it was a very interesting experience. I stayed there 10 years. That was enough, I think. Anyway, did that answer your question? No?
Yes, to a certain extent, but I think I'm always curious about that move, even for myself, career-wise. What approach do you take? Why would you, obviously as academics, it's a very different approach to development than as the organization like the World Bank. And I just wonder about, the conflict between obviously being an academic in theory and being a practitioner, or being within an organization like that.
Well,
And what the thought process is.
I always say, and it's very trite, but I always say that actually the thing about academics is that you're there to show what's wrong. You're there to critique. It's an institutional structure where you're critiquing what's wrong. If you move into the world of practitioners and practice, you have to show what's right. So these are totally contradictory worlds in a way. And and I guess the thing that I've tried to do in my life is to go between them. So I haven't stayed in one type and I haven't stayed in the other, but I think you learn an enormous amount by going into an operational practice institution. For me, the big shock when I went to it was, of course, the World Bank is driven by economists and econometrics. And I often lecture to DPU and others and say, okay, how many economists in the room? And there are virtually never any. And yet this is an institution that is driven by economics. And there's me, who was a social anthropologist, trying to change what they thought about urban poverty. But I wasn't an economist. So I had to learn how to work with economists. And I think that's the thing, again, that if you move into different worlds, you're learning a lot more about the discipline background, the way other disciplines think. I mean, I know we talk about us all being multidiscipline, but actually different institutions. And that's why I often recently, as you know, Nora, I've written about what I call the institutional positionality of where you are influences an incredible amount of what you can do. But you can also have your own individual positionality. And sometimes they work together okay, which is what I reckoned happened in the DPU. The World Bank, they certainly didn't, and that's partly why I left. I mean, my own individual positionality was very, very different, and also, you know, I thought I would work on gender, and I was dead naive, because in these type of bureaucratic institutions, you work on the issue that you're allocated to work on. You're not there because of your knowledge that you come with. You're there because you're in an institutional position. And I had to learn that actually, other than the economists, who were the ones that did the real research, everybody else were sort of bureaucratic professionals. And they'd learn a bit about the subject, all that. They'd hire consultants in to do the work, but basically they were bureaucrats. And I decided that that wasn't for me. I wanted to continue this relationship between research, building sort of frameworks, theoretical frameworks, and then turning them into operational frameworks that practitioners could work with. So that's what I've tried to do. And the bank was one bit of the equation, but it wasn't the total one, and I left.
I mean, yeah, I'm glad you just mentioned frameworks, because obviously at the same time that you were at the World Bank, what was happening was that the framework that you had developed at the DPU, or what some people call the Moser framework, but obviously I don't know how you feel about that, but was also was becoming popular, and was something that development practitioners were adopting as a way of working. And so, yeah, do you want to talk about the framework for a bit, or was it this time that you moved to the Ford Foundation then?
No, I never moved to the Ford Foundation. The Ford Foundation, and this gets you to the point about how do you get opportunities. I was incredibly fortunate, because actually when I was at the DPU, I persuaded the Ford to fund me with some money, which allowed me to go around the world and talk to women planners about, did they think this idea of gender planning was useful. So that's how I started with the Ford. And then later, when I was doing work on assets and vulnerability, again, I got resources from the Ford. So I never worked in the Ford Foundation itself. But the frameworks, yeah, I think that's what I like doing, you see, and that's what I did first with gender. So we took a whole lot of very complex ideas and thought, well, okay, how do we turn them into an operational framework that practitioners can grasp, can understand? And it got very criticized by academics, because they said it depoliticized it. And that's the interesting thing when you work academically, you can be highly political and critique everything. If you work operationally with practitioners, you have to work with people who don't necessarily agree with what you're coming up with. And so you've got to find a framework that operationally works for them. And that's what we did with gender planning. That when I was at the World Bank, they never took it on at all. So I moved from working on gender there because it was impossible. I mean, and anyway, I wasn't hired to work. It turns out I was hired to work on poverty. I became Ms. Poverty. So that's when I started to think about, okay, let's not look at poverty per se. Let's look at the way the poor accumulate assets. And that's how I developed the frameworks that I've worked a lot of my life on, which is looking at asset accumulation and the reduction of poverty, or asset violence and the erosion of assets, or climate change and what happens with the adaptation of assets. That all started at the bank, yeah. And it was out of frustration with them not allowing me to really work on violence. In fact, when the Beijing, in 1995, they didn't allow me to go to Beijing, because outside in the real world, a lot of people thought my work was rather good on gender, and the bank thought, oh my God, we don't want her going near Beijing. So I was literally not allowed to go. That's the power of these institutions. Or if I could have gone, I would have lost my job. And at the time I was in the middle of all this other research, and I thought, no, I can't do that. Anyway, so that's how it was.
I mean, to be fair, like one of the things that I'd wanted to ask you about, obviously, was the idea of being a woman at the time who was constantly finding herself in the situations where, you were either being sidelined by more powerful men within organizations, or even just finding yourself as a lone dissenting voice. But actually, before we get to that, because we have a little bit of time, I was wondering if it might be interesting for the students to hear more about your framework. Since obviously we're all DPU students and we're all interested, if you would like to just tell us a bit more about the asset accumulation framework and just the move from individual empowerment to transformational, because I know for my work, for example, I just find it absolutely fascinating. And I don't know if you would like to.
Sure. what you see, what I've tried to do, and I often say this to people, students who are moving ahead in their own careers, is that I've always had what I call the building block principle, which means that whatever research or practitioner work you're doing, you make sure that the next work builds on it. So you're not disparately doing different things all over the place. I have two sons, and they know very well my building block principle, because I've given them a ton of advice over the years about what, making sure, don't just go off and do something because it's interesting in the middle of nowhere if it doesn't connect with what you did before. So assets, yeah, I moved into working on assets at the bank, and then I worked a lot on assets, and I really have found it a very helpful framework. I worked way beyond the bank on urban violence. And then when I was at Manchester, where I ended up, we did a lot of work. I did with a lovely guy called Alfredo Stein. We've done a lot of work on climate. And I might say climate is much easier to work on, though of course it's a terrible problem. It's not as politically difficult as to work on gender, let alone violence. So, but it's a framework that I've used. And then what happened was that, having done all of that, I decided, I think it's time now to go back and look at gender. Because, and this was the Ford said to me, Caroline, I was advising them on their urban strategy or whatever it was. And they said to me, we don't understand where gender is. What's going on with gender and cities. And so I thought, let's look at transformation. Let's go beyond empowerment, which is by then was the sort of dominant approach, to how do we empower individual women. If you look at DFID, if you look at a lot of the agencies, that's where they're sort of at. And a lot of the academic discourse is on the empowerment, but it's about individual women. And what I have been interested in more recently is, how do you think about structural change, and how structural change transforms power relations? Very tough, very difficult, doesn't happen automatically, and is very different from the individual women's empowerment. And that's what I've ended up working on. So I took the whole gender idea and the gender framework, but turned from looking at planning and so on into how do we look at the transformation of urban societies, of communities, of sectors of the economy, and what they're doing for women. So that's where transformation has, and that's what I work on now. And again, what's very interesting is there's a lot of critiquing by the academics, but there's a lot of practitioners who are now using it because it's operational, and they can actually relate it to the reality that they work in, and they can challenge others with it. You asked me about what it was like being a woman working with men. It's been tough. It does get a bit easier, but there's two sides to it. So the DPU, I was the only woman. When I was in the bank, very much dominated by men, and also, and if you worked on something like gender, you were totally ignored, because it was such a soft issue. So in a way, working on poverty was much more mainstream, and meant that you were taken more seriously as a woman. No, there are lots of things one could talk. I remember at the DPU when I was hired, there's a chap who shall be nameless who was also hired, a man, a transport planner. And I only found out a lot later, of course, he was hired at a much higher salary than I was. Now you guys wouldn't allow that, and that's one of the things that's changed, and people are much more transparent. But women tend to be hired, they're so grateful to have a job, they get hired at a low rate. When I was in the DPU, there was a time when the DPU was in such crisis, they were talking about, well, who shall we fire? And they thought, oh, Caroline, we'll fire her because she's got a husband. And actually I was in the middle of a divorce, and I had to go and say to them, excuse me, I'm a primary income earner, and please don't just fire me because you think I'm a woman. And that's something. So these are the things that happen to women, and they continue. I mean, they're all of these institutions are still. Manchester University, where I ended up, there's some wonderful women who work there, but it's a very male institution as an institution. So yeah, it's been a challenge. But I think the other thing to say, and one has to be very careful in saying it, is that because it's so competitive, the whole idea of sort of sisterhood, and we're all women and we all help each other, doesn't necessarily happen. There's a lot of competition between women because the positions are so few, or have been so few. I think it's changing fundamentally now. But so the idea that because we're all women and we're good feminists and we sort of believe in each other and what we're doing means we support each other, doesn't necessarily happen. It's a bit of both, really.
Okay, well, I mean, For sure. And I would argue that obviously it's the competitive world that forces us to compete against each other in these positions, because there's just such a small space. But then within that framework, how do you then start to gather allies, and how do you start empowering the women around you to start actually having an influence? How do you go from, you know, that competing atmosphere to an atmosphere where actually you're all working together towards something significant?
I think it's very tough, but you know, actually, Colin Marks was talking to me the other day in DPU about legacy, and who are the people that have really been your role models. And I think actually, when I think about it, Michael Saviour at the DPU was. There's the guy who hired me at the World Bank, Michael Cohen, again was. So isn't it interesting? Neither of them are women; they're men. But I have had very, very important relationships, also mainly with women who were also challenging gender issues in the same way that I was. And that differs from pure academicians sitting in academic institutions. So I think, you know, finding your role models. I don't underestimate having what I call, in a very sort of participation manner, patrons. I've worked a lot in Latin America, and a patron is the person who basically backs you. And I think that the Ford Foundation was an amazing institution in that way, in that, and there were just amazing people there, starting with a woman, Kate McGee, when I was at DPU, but also a fantastic, actually, he was a Mexican psychologist called Pablo Farias, who really backed me in the asset work. He believed in it and he wanted it to go further. You see, if you sit in pure academic institutions, you apply for grants and it's straightforward. You get the grant, you don't get the grant, you do the research. If you work in this crazy world where you're trying to influence practice, you're trying to change ideas for practitioners, it's not as straightforward. And that's where I have been very, very lucky by realizing which institutions were interested in urban. That was the criteria. And then saying, okay, well, now there's this gender issue, or there's this climate issue, or this other issue, which is urban related. The Netherlands, the Dutch were amazing for a long time. The Swedes were amazing for a long time. These are institutions that backed research, but understood the relationship between research and actually practitioners. And most recently, Alfredo and I did a big study of climate change in Honduras, in Tegucigalpa, and it was the Nordic Development Fund that funded us. And that means, you know, in the world that I'm in, you've got to know these people, you've got to go and visit them, you've got to go and hustle. And I don't know that academics think hustling is something very, 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 this is what you have to do. You have to go and talk to them. You have to persuade them.
Yeah.
Sell it to them.
I mean, what I'm about to say, especially in the middle of a lot of academics, might be a bit controversial, but do you think that position, being in that position to go and hustle and to know these contacts, is it something that you were able to acquire as a practitioner, as having worked in the World Bank, or was it something that could have been achieved, you know, behind a desk as a researcher and as an academic?
You know, I learned it in the DPU because the DPU had no money. And if you wanted to do anything, you had to go find it. And seriously, you had to go find it. And that's where I first learned. And I remember a few years later, a very eminent feminist said to me, Caroline, you've been so successful. You've got all this money. And I said, yeah, but you know, I don't sit writing in the summer holidays. I don't sit writing academic articles. I'm out there trying to see how do we operationalize, how do we roll out something that is different and new. And so, you know, I don't have a big highly academic track record. I haven't published a lot of the time in highly intellectual journals. I'm much more interested, and that's why some of you may know Environment and Urbanization, fantastic journal, but it's a journal that reaches practitioners, and it's influenced where I've published, it's influenced how much I've published. But yeah, I mean, I think that I think in some ways it's a lot easier now, in the sense that there's a lot of urban money out there, but there are these enormous big grants. And I sometimes think that to be a much smaller person doing things yourself is sort of not easier, but it's more manageable in a way. So it's both sides of things have changed a lot over the years, and I'm not sure that the same institutions fund now in the way they did during that period. So it's like you have to find what's a cutting edge issue that nobody's working on. Who out there thinks this is an important operational issue in terms of urban development? Always been urban. Always. I mean, there's been times where people say, oh, you know, you should go to the rural areas. You know, you only got half the story. You only work urban. I've always worked urban. It was one of the decisions I made. I said, yeah, I know there's a big wide world out there, but I'm not going to understand everything. And I've been very, very focused in that way on urban and urban development and urban planning and so
on. You know, I think for me, one of the things that I find absolutely fascinating about, you know, the journey that you're telling us about is the fact that you've tried a few different routes, the persistence of trying to find a way to make something that you want to happen. And that's, you know, as students, as academics, as people who are starting out, I think these are kind of the thought processes that happen in my head all the time. You know, what's the best approach to take? And then obviously your journey as the only woman or as a dissenting voice, as someone who's trying to say, you know, what about gender? I've often found myself in a room full of a lot of people where I'm constantly being like, what about the women? What about the gender issue? And especially, obviously, you know, I don't know if you all know, but I'm from Egypt. I'm, you know, from the Middle East, where this issue isn't necessarily a very popular one. And you constantly have to find yourself having the energy to constantly be that person who's constantly saying this matters, you know. And I think, I don't know, I mean, I look at you and I think, oh my God, you know, you spoke of role models. You're definitely a role model, but I think it would be really interesting to hear, you know, what advice you would have for people who are trying to influence, to make, you know, to change the world, or as we all are, for the better. What advice would you give?
I think your question is very, very important. And I think, you know, it's very important for me too, just to remind myself, which I do a lot, that it hasn't been straightforward and it hasn't been simple. And that actually, in a sense, I think having a belief, I really believed in gender planning. I was passionate about it. I used to go out and tell everybody about it. And so like when you're saying you're in a meeting and you're the only one in the room, you know, who cares about these issues, and everybody looks at you and says, oh God, here comes the woman. She's going to talk about gender. And quite a lot of women make a decision that they're not going to work on gender for precisely that reason. And so it's tough. It's very tough at the beginning. But I think you have to be careful not to conflate yourself, the personal, with the professional of the issue that you're going to work on. And I think that's what I had to learn how to do. And that allowed me then to think about, well, you know, poverty and poverty issues and what are the gender issues in them, but not to stick just a lot of, I mean, there are very successful women who have worked all their lives just on gender and haven't tried to sort of broaden it into a sort of broader perspective. And that's why, and I'm repeating myself in a way, but that's why I found urban so helpful, because it allowed me then to think myself about these issues, you know. And of course, as you say, there are parts of the world where it is very, very complicated to work on gender issues and still remains so. And yet you can see changes that have happened. I mean, I can also say, well, the great thing is you're an Egyptian, so the Egyptians take you seriously. I used to work a lot in Latin America, and Latin American women would turn on me and say, but Caroline, you're not Latin American. How can you tell us these things? And that's all about our identities and where our identities are. And after all years and years and years of working in Latin America, these same women said to me, oh, you know, now we will say you're a nominal Latin American. It wasn't easy though. So you are constantly doing this, not just in terms of your identity and working on this issue, but also in your own identity in terms of where you come from and where you work. It's a real challenge, but I think it's very exciting. And I was actually brought up in Southern Africa. And yes, I never until very I was banned and I didn't go there for 30 years, but that's where my roots were, and that's where my primary and high school was in South Africa. So I've always had the strong identity with South Africa, but that again is a complicated identity because of my skin. I'm not black. So, you know, and I actually went and worked in Latin America because I found it much easier. And I found that I actually, the Latin American women and what Latin America, where they were at working on gender issues was just so fascinating and so empowering. And I just enjoyed it enormously. Anyway.
Yeah, no, the thing is, I think you read my mind there. One of the things that I was thinking about when I was talking about Egypt is that the thing that I find keeps me going, or the thing that where my passion comes, is the communities that I've worked with.
Yeah.
And I thought it might be good to give you a chance, since we have a little bit of time, to talk about your experience in Ecuador and the community that you lived in, and all the friends and allies that you've made in Latin America, and how that has shaped both your work and your identity as an individual.
So I went to, I did my PhD in Bogota. I was married for a long time to a documentary filmmaker, and he made very famous films and a series called Disappearing World in the 70s, always in these remote, beautiful, exotic tribal locations. And I, of course, was an urban anthropologist. So we decided that we would make a film together. And we would go to Guayaquil, and Guayaquil was chosen because if any of you've seen anything about it, it was very visually beautiful. All these people squatting in bamboo houses on the edge of the city. And he said, that will make a great movie. It's very visual. So off I went with my kids. I took them out of school for a year, and we went and we lived in this community, and we built our own house of 4 by 8 meters bamboo hut. And we lived in this community. And it was the most, if you're talking about transformational, of everything I've done, it was the most transformational thing I ever did. It blew my mind, and it was very tough. I mean, and there I was in a situation in a bamboo hut where I didn't know how to deal with dogs that were rabid and would bite you. And the women had to say, Caroline, this is what you do. You pour water on them, you do this. I learned from the women. And it was there when that's where I really began understanding, or wanting to understand more about gender and gender relations. So we lived there for about 9 months, and for all sorts of complicated reasons that had nothing to do with us, the trade union movement in the UK in the 70s, etc. The film wasn't made, and then we went back and made the film in 81. And Brian, my then husband, and I, we separated, but I continued to go to this community. And actually, that's the sort of thing, thinking when I lecture students, I say, for goodness sake, if you go anywhere, think longitudinally, which I didn't originally. I just went there, but I just learnt so much from them. So there in 81, I went back with no money. I was at LSE by then. No, I was still at DPU. And I got myself there in the summer. And I did a tiny bit of work actually on women and political, and how political women were at the local level, the community managers. That's where I learned about that. And I kept going back and kept going back. And I've done this now, for over 40 years. And you're quite right, because my elder son, lovely guy who always wanted to be a filmmaker, but actually works he works on community trusts and sort of these sort of things. He said to me, Mum, I want to go back to Guayaquil and make another movie there. He hadn't been there for 40 years. So that was when, yes, it's 3 years ago, I decided, you know what, I'm now going to learn how to be a camera woman, which was quite complicated. I had to go to the film school and, do courses, and he sort of taught me a bit, and then I did a bit of home. But that was necessary because I wanted to make a film about him going back to this community that he hadn't been there for 40 years, linking up with the daughter of the community leader, who was my great friend. And these two kids were the same age, and they're now middle age. So I had to film him going in. We made this crazy movie, which we showed at the DPU this time last year, just before lockdown. So, and if any of you want to see it, we can certainly get you the link to it. So yes, you're quite right. I think I thought I'd done enough of this other type of work. But the point about the community in Guayaquil is that over the years, doing these different things, but always going back, a lot of reciprocity, making sure that they own the film. I wrote a book about the community. I got resources, that was from the Ford, to translate it into Spanish. We went, and about 40 members of the community have their own copy of that book. So a lot of reciprocity going on through all this period. But everything I've learned, I have to be honest and say, almost always has started with this community. And just one more sentence and I'll stop. You know, when I was there in 1992 doing a restudy, because I incorporated it into this big study we did in the World Bank, I incorporated Guayaquil, and I went there and the community said to me, you know what? Life has become incredibly violent, 1992. And I went back to the bank and said, you know, violence is a development problem. And they said, no, it's a behavioral issue. And that's how I started to roll out in the bank the work on violence, linking it to assets. And we had a lot of, you know, we worked in Jamaica on it, we worked in different countries, showing them and incorporating it into the work they did. Where did it come from? It came from the community in Guayaquil. They were the ones that have taught me so much. And as an anthropologist, I'm just deeply indebted to them. I mean, you know, I owe so much to them. And so I learned a lot about poverty. I learned about assets. So they didn't call it that. They called it housing, you know, got to own a house. That's the most important asset, even if it's a bamboo shack, you know. So yeah, that was my, and I still, you know, now with Corona, I've been in a lot of contact with them. They've had a terrible time. So, you know, the technologies have changed. And so the kids of my son's age all are on WhatsApp and all this sort of jazz. And so, you know, we keep in touch still. It's been amazing place to know. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was there. I watched the video last year when you came into DPU, and I saw the you know, the film, the community, and I remember you telling us stories about when you lived there. I think it's a very important lesson about how, you know, you learn this stuff from being in the community and from being part of it. I think now is about the time where I should probably open it up a little bit for the rest of you, if anyone has any questions to ask. I mean, I'm never going to run out of things to ask or speak to Caroline about, but you know, it's only fair that you all get a chance as well. Anyone?
Yeah, just unmute yourselves now.
Yeah, unmute or physically raise your hand first so you're not all unmuting at the same time. Kamna?
Okay. Hi, Noor, thank you very much, Caroline. That was great hearing you talking in such a personable way about a really long and very inspiring career in the same way that Noor spoke about your work. So I work at the DPU. I've been here for several years as an associate professor, and I used your asset vulnerability framework in my PhD many years ago. So I'm very grateful to you for developing it and giving me that intellectual framework. So it's interesting to hear you describe it as maybe not as academic or not as intellectual, perhaps, as a more operational side of things, because I think it does both. And that's the beauty of the framework. What I wanted to ask you, though, is a little bit, I don't know, it's a little bit more reflections based. If I think now about what are the big issues, the big dilemmas when we think about gender and development broadly as a field, and with that critical academic reflection on what's been missing all these years, there are two things that come to my mind. One is perhaps an inadequate or missing or something like that engagement with gender as something that exists outside of a binary. And so looking at the multiple ways in which gender is inhabited as an identity and used in operational ways by people and always has been. And then the second is much more focused on, I suppose it might be called now, intersectional ways of understanding gender. And there are many different dimensions to that. And one would be, I suppose, from a development planning perspective, where you've got certain types of women planning on behalf of other types of women, where we can see these distinctions being forged, not primarily, but certainly on the basis of race and ethnicity, as well as a shared gender identity, perhaps. And then the other is within practices of development. So outside of that meta planning framework, on the day-to-day, the interactions that occur between women who might have nothing in common, despite being women, and where race and ethnicity particularly feature in the complexities of gender planning. And to frame it as a question, looking back, when you were developing the work initially around gender planning, gender and development, what was the attention to questions of binary and non-binary and race? And perhaps why did they not feature back then?
They're very, very, very good questions. And it shows so well that you are a different generation from me, and that, thank goodness, other generations are now taking on a lot of the issues that maybe I started. I think for the first, to answer very, very, very clearly, you know, when we started working on gender, nobody even took gender seriously. So I mean, of course, there were the academics working on it. And one of the most important influences at the time was IDS, where there were people like Kate Young. This is pre-Naila Kabir, but who was then there, but Kate Young, and there was a whole, who worked on the subordination of women. And this was a whole theoretical framework around women. And what, in a sense, I tried to do with the what you called, thank you, Noor, the Moser framework, was I tried to develop, how do you take all that complexity and make it acceptable for practitioners who really reject it all. And I can tell you that that's where training, and I'll come back to that point about the issues that you're raising. How do you build these ideas? How do you build ownership of these ideas? Do you do it academically by writing articles, or do you by building the capacity of people to recognize their importance? And I mean, you know, I started with a woman called Rosalind Aben, who was at what was DFID, was ODA at the time, running these workshops and we would have 12 men in suits who arrived and complained and went and looked at their watches and said, oh my God, we all, because the head of DFID at the time was a bloke called Chris Patton, who then became very important in the Hong Kong thing. And everybody joked he had 4 daughters, and that's why he said gender was important. But he said it was obligatory to do training. And that's how we began. But the resistance was appalling, absolutely appalling. And so what you developed was a methodology, particularly like things like where you said, okay, tell me about the 24-hour day. And you got practitioners themselves to go through the day that they thought about, and what men were doing and women were doing. And I always remember, actually wasn't there, it was when I did it in Peru, there was this wonderful sort of academic, lovely man who started to talk about the 24-hour day. And he said, well, my wife gets herself ready for work. She's a professional academic, while the maid goes and gets the milk from the whatever. And then my wife does this and the maid does that. And, you know, he was talking about class without knowing about it. He wasn't talking about race and he wasn't talking about ethnicity. He was talking about class. Even class wasn't recognized. And yet, so the way we did it in this capacity building was around getting people themselves to talk about it. And to be quite honest, in the 1980s, the whole issue of it being a dualist binaryism, it was enough to get that on board, even though it had obvious limitations. So we didn't. And I think much more important as well at the time were the issues of ethnicity and race. I've worked a lot with Asian women, and Asian women were very, very clear from the start about the whole caste issue. So caste got integrated in, they owned it. It wasn't for me to own it, they owned it. When I worked with the Latin Americans, as I say, it was the class issue they were more preoccupied with. So I think it's where the positionality and where people are situated in the positionality, which has influenced what happened. I found it really, and I did say this a little earlier, I found it very difficult to work in Africa. I've worked a lot, actually, more recently in Africa on things like climate change and other issues. But for me, it always was very difficult because I had a liberal white South African childhood. And I had to really come to terms in my own reflections and reflexivity about my positionality then, about how that related to what was happening under apartheid to people who were not white, as it were. I think that's what's happening now, is that there's you could say that, and Noor was saying, you know, in Egypt, she still has problems saying, hey, gender is important. But I think in a lot of contexts, we've moved so far, and all of us have moved so far, that a lot of these other intersectional issues are absolutely critically being addressed. And you can look back and you say it was incredibly simplistic what we did. It was. And it was simplistic because we actually needed to find a way of getting people to take on issues that were very, very important. And I mean, I think the world has changed fundamentally. I mean, Black Lives Matter, you just need to look at the political issues that are out there to know that you wouldn't use this type of framework as the simplistic framework that was done then. Now you wouldn't. But I think, and this is something to say to everybody that I find very interesting, is that I sort of get embarrassed sometimes because somebody persuaded me, Sylvia Chant, you may know Sylvia, sadly she passed away last year, but she was she started, by the way, as my research assistant as well. And Sylvia was the one who said, Caroline, you should get onto Google Scholar and see who's using your work. I'm just not attuned to this sort of stuff. I mean, there's Sylvia sitting in the LSE. So I got onto Google Scholar and I get sort of embarrassed when I see people are citing work that I did in the 1980s or the 1990s, because it's not relevant now, I think. So one of the things is this time lag, the time lag between the stuff that you're getting to read and frustrates you and where you are and your positionality and the issues that are important for you. And I think there is this time lag, and that's why well, I just think there is a time lag, but I mean, I think your points your points are very, very well taken. It's not that I don't think asset accumulation is a useful and a theoretical framework. That's how I used it in the bank, and the way we achieved what we achieved in the bank was by actually me finding a young economist who could do the econometrics that I couldn't do because I'm not trained in econometrics. And that's about working collaboratively. This is a young guy. And he and I did the econometrics together to really show how useful this framework was for economists. And then it was much easier to roll it out as a theoretical framework, which of course is what it started as. Yeah. No, you're right. Anyway, very good questions. Thank you very much. I hope I answered sort of. Yeah.
While you were speaking, Caroline, while you were responding, I was thinking about what you said earlier about building blocks and how I think maybe that is also the way to approach this in my head, at least when I think about the intergenerational different approaches to feminism and intergenerational racism, that obviously, one thing that does lead to another, and you wouldn't have reached where we are now if that hadn't happened. So even when people the reason that we're all still citing your work from the 80s and the 90s was because, that was definitely the foundation. So
yeah.
Anyway, any other questions?
Come on, this is meant to be tea and we're meant to be chatting. So
yeah,
let's get some other questions out there.
I could keep asking questions, but I'm sure you're getting sick of my voice. So if not, I wanted to ask you, Caroline, something about positionality because you touched on that. And I think, during you were speaking, obviously and part of the paper that you wrote that informed today's session as well was also about the different positions that you've held and the different views and how they've changed over the years. So maybe you can discuss your positionality a bit while we wait for someone to come up with a question and how that can change based on where you are.
Yeah, that's a nice question. I wrote an article on how I'd moved from gender planning to gender transformation. And the journal I sent it to turned it down and said, this is rubbish. We're not interested in this. And, so anybody can have something turned down. It's not just when you start off. And actually, what I realized then was I needed to rethink how to write this so that it was acceptable. And because actually what they said was gender planning is irrelevant. So why are you writing about gender planning? And that's where I started to read a lot of stuff about positionality, which I found very, very interesting. And also what I began to realize is that there, as I said to you earlier, that we our institutional positionality about where we are working can fundamentally influence how far we can be effective and what we can do. But we also have our own individual positionality. And sometimes these work together and sometimes they don't. And I read a lot about this and also about reflexivity. And I decided, okay, I'm going to rewrite the whole of this so that everybody can, not say, well, we all think gender planning was so non-political that it was really not very helpful. It was the technification of gender issues, which is what a lot of feminists have said, I decided to write it about where I was. I was in an urban planning unit. I wanted to reach practitioners. My positionality in the DPU was incredibly influenced by the positionality of a lot of the people that I was working with there, who really taught me about planning. I knew nothing about planning. I mean, I was an urban anthropologist, but my goodness, I learned about it in the DPU. And then moving on, I think the different positionalities of different institutions. And so I look at the bank and the working inside the World Bank, whereas I say there was a really quite a difference between my own individual positionality on issues and the banks. And so then I moved on. But I do think it's an interesting concept, but I think it's not disaggregating it and not just saying about positionality, but as Kamala said, you know, your positionality is as much influenced by your own individual history, race, ethnicity, age, sexuality, all of these issues add up, as it is about the institution that you work in. And sometimes these can be in parallel, but often they're not. And you're having to work with institutions that are not necessarily the same as you. So for me, it was actually a very interesting way of not justifying, because I don't, you know, you don't need to say, you know, what do I justify? You've done what you've done in your life, you know, for good or for bad. I mean, I don't want to justify that I went to the bank. I don't want to justify that I found the LSE very boring. You know, it wasn't for me, the LSE. I mean, I left I left a permanent tenured position, for goodness sake, at the LSE. And people said, my goodness, how can you do that? I never, you know, DPU, we had 1-year contracts. We never had the sort of permanency that you probably have now. I don't know, Cameron, are you on a permanent contract? Yeah. In my day, you weren't. You were on 1-year contracts all the way through, you know, and I had to get divorced in the middle of that and think, God, am I going to have a job next year to look after my kids? So anyway, the point is that I think that one's own positionality is influenced by a lot of fundamental issues, and some of them are similar to other people and some of them aren't, you know. Yeah. So
any other questions? No. All right, then why don't we stay on the theme of positionality, because this is also something that I, you know, now, and obviously this was a development that happened within feminist research, but one of the things was that feminists kind of criticized the way that we conduct research, and they really started asking people to be reflexive in the way that we actually conduct research and the way that we write. And so again, it's about, as a practitioner, your position within those communities. And I'm not sure, was it the participatory appraisal that you used to work on, right?
Yeah, well, what happened, you see, was that when I went to the World Bank, remember, I'm an urban anthropologist, and anthropologists did in those days, you went into a community and you did what's called participatory observation, where you observed everything, and the whole of the discipline is built on a methodology where you are learning from people, but in this qualitative participatory, in this way. And then I went to the bank, and because I wanted to be taken seriously when we did the big study, it was a 5 years research in 4 cities across the world. We did quantitative surveys, and we did a community survey, and we did all of this stuff. And at the end of 5 years, the guys in the bank who, when the results came up, and this is to make you laugh, said, well, yeah, this is an interesting study, but it's anecdotal because it is not representative at the country level. i.e. we had worked absolutely meticulously using the same methodology in 4 cities in 4 different parts of the world, in the Philippines, in Zambia, in Hungary, and in Ecuador. And they said to me, you know, yeah, very interesting, but of course you should have done a country level survey. And at that point I decided I've had enough. I am not going to do this stuff. And participatory research was was coming out. And then one of the guys in the bank, who was a smart guy, said he was doing a social fund in Jamaica. And he said to me, we need to know about violence in Jamaica. He'd picked up the violence story. And he said, we need to know about violence. So Caroline, you know, because in a way, when you're inside the bank, you're like an internal contractor, because people have to hire you to do things. It's not as though you have a wonderful position and you just get on with your work. You are contracted internally by different people. So he said, well, we want that. And I decided, and I said, fine, I'll do it. Fine, we'll do work on urban violence in Jamaica. That's not a problem. But by the way, I'm not going to just look at secondary data. I'm going to do a participatory appraisal. I've never done one before. And I just decided that I'd had enough of these guys who told me that my stuff wasn't representative when I'd spent 5 years working on it. So you know what, in 5 months flat, I got the money again, because the game in the bank is that the donors, bilateral donors, want to influence the bank, or did. And so none of the research is done in the bank is funded by the bank. It's all the bilaterals that give the money, right? So I went to DFID, where I knew people, and I said, look, we want to do this work in Jamaica. So I went through the training myself. I'm a great believer that you put yourself through this type of training, as indeed I did to be a camerawoman years later. So I did it with an amazing woman called Mira Shah, who worked with Robert Chambers and was very tough. And put me through, we took everybody through the training, and the guy I did it with had been a master's student of mine at LSE, Jeremy Holland, who since has done a lot of participatory work. And I hired Jeremy. I said, come on, I need you to help me do it. We both went through the training. We did the participatory study. And since then, that's what I've done again and again and again, is used participatory methodologies. I've worked on violence on it, I've worked on climate on it, and I found it a fantastic methodology. And one of the things I've done, because I am a believer in trying to influence people, is I've done a lot of work on how you can quantify from participatory methodologies, which is quite controversial, let's say. Recently, a few years ago, we did some work in Chile, where we were looking at violence and looking not just at the poor, but also the middle class and the elite and their different views of violence. And I was working with colleagues in Chile who didn't believe in quantifying participatory methodology at all. So they had their results and I had mine. But yeah, I've used participatory. And the thing about participatory methodology, as I'm sure you must know, is that every time you do it, you're training up 15, 20, whatever number of people in that country. And then they have it, they own it, they take it, they use it further. So we've used in the same way that we did with the gender training, the gender planning training, and where people take ownership of these things and then use them themselves. The same happened with the participatory work. I have a great friend called Grace Lubali, who works in Kenya. He's a wonderful man. We've had a lot of ups and downs in our lives together, but we worked in 3 different studies, and he does a fantastic amount of participatory research. So there are amazing people and they all have their own techniques that they've learned in different places. And then what you do is you train together so that everybody's on board. And yeah, it's been fun to do. I mean, how many of you are thinking of using, because there's such a silence there, any of you done any participatory work or think it's a useful methodology or not? So Nelly's nodding. Tell us, Nelly, what you think.
I mean, I've just joined the DPU as a research fellow, and on a project working on urban sanitation. Right. So, and I think that it's been designed by Adriana Allen and Pascal Hoffman, and I think they really place participatory approach at the center of the project, not just to gather data, but really as actually one of the long-term outputs is training communities to self-assess, not just sanitation, but way beyond. So I think it will be both a method, but really one output of our project.
Yeah, and this is what people know, because is Cameron still with us? So another thing that has come on board and everybody talks about now is co-production. And co-production didn't exist when I started my stuff. And then I started to think, well, how much of it was co-production? And certainly the last movie we made with Titus and the community was co-production. And then I listened to a webinar the other day where they were launching a book on resilience, which Alex must have heard them doing. And there was a guy who said, well, there's co-benefit and co-production. And I picked that up and I thought, God, that's really interesting. So if you're thinking about, I listen and I think, and I went back and said, what's the difference? And actually a lot of what is called co-production is really co-benefit. You know, I'm going to do this research in your community and it's going to benefit your community because you can use this and this, that, and the other way. And it's quite different from co-production. So I think when I think back, and I just heard this and I thought that I haven't heard that before. I don't know if any of you have. And I thought that is so interesting. And if I look back, I think a lot of what I've done has been co-production in terms of working when you work together on the development of the methodology and you recognize that actually the positionality of the people you are with. I'm thinking now, I trained a whole bunch of high school educated, mainly women, fantastic field workers in Mombasa once on climate. And they knew far more what was going to go on, and their positionality was very different from mine. And working through with them what we were going to use in this work was very, very interesting. So that for me is, when you're talking, Nelly, about how far it's co-production, how far it's co-benefit that they will take it. I think that that's also a very interesting sort of conceptualization to think about. And we can go back and think about it in terms of assets work or gender or whatever framework one's working on, because I think that is, we've moved beyond participatory methodologies as a justification in themselves to understanding what is it that they're used for, and is it a form of co-production? Or is it really, there's a Swedish, very big Swedish program called Urban Mistra, Urban, and I evaluated a lot of their co-production work and how it was and how they worked on it. They were early people to work on it. They're linked to some folks in Sheffield. So there's a lot of very interesting work going on it. And I'm sure Adriana sort of links up with all that type of work, yeah. So yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, we're a little bit over the time now, but I still many people haven't spoken yet. So I just want to give one last chance if anyone has a final question before we close.
Yeah, I don't want to ask too many extra questions because we are over time, but Caroline, I'm intrigued to get your thoughts on the women and girls agenda that seems to be very present, particularly in donor speak, and has critiqued as really infantilizing people that are women, and just this grouping together that, and I don't think it's an academic critique. I think it's very much a lived, grounded critique as well of women and girls together. And I'm wondering, what is your take on that? What is your reflection on how have we arrived at women and girls?
Oh, I can tell you, I mean, it was, well, I know a little bit about it. I mean, it's sort of anecdotal information that DFID, was looking for a partner, and Nike came along and said, oh yeah, we'll partner with you, but we're interested in girls, and girls are the future of everything, and you can see this rhetoric about girls and let's empower girls, let's educate girls. It started way back. I mean, the whole idea that, it's women who hold up years ago, we used to talk about, there was all this stuff about women hold up 3/4 of the world and they only get 2% of the income or whatever it was. So I think, I think it's very dangerous. And I think along with it being, I don't know if dangerous is the word, I think it's totally disempowering of women, and it's totally disempowering of girls. And it's conflating a lot of issues. And I find, what I find also very problematic, and in fact, I do a bit of a critique of it in this article, but is the way women's empowerment is seen to be the panacea of everything. You see, if you empower women individually, then that will, and the whole thing about transformation, which is what I've tried to show and have worked on, is that it may empower individual women, but it's not going to change the structural power relations in any way. They will still continue. So you educate individual women, but unless you change the curriculum, unless you change the ways classrooms work, unless you change all sorts of things that are going on, you are not making any structural changes. Years and years and years ago, I read a wonderful study by an Italian woman of how girls were treated in school as against boys. You can imagine Italy in the 1970s, right? And the girls were all trained to be little mothers and of course Italy, to be beautiful and to, you know, all of those sorts of things. And the men and the boys were all trained, and they did different things in class. And this is way back in the 1970s, people were writing about this stuff. And yet, you know, all these decades later, it's the donors that have taken these on. And I mean, you know, the World Bank included. The World Bank are the ones that were, and the reason the World Bank did it is that, you see, the logic, and I understand it, I don't agree with it, is the only way you can get people to take women seriously if you can show their economic benefit. So the World Bank rolls out an econometric view of women, right? If you look at the World Development Report on the gender one, it's all economic. And I know the woman, Karen Groen, who was heading the work, who's done it. She's a very fine feminist economist. But, you know, we all, and this is around, by the way, coming back to some people's questions about positionality. She's had to shift her own positionality within an institution and to take on the economic arguments to be taken seriously. And you can say that she was very successful. And I've known a lot of I've known numerous of the women who had the gender and development lead position in the World Bank and watched what they tried to do to shift the bank on it. They've been very, you could say, more successful, but it's entirely around the econometric view that actually what can women contribute, right? And our own government does it. You know, when they talk about empowering women and educating women and educating girls and so on, it is entirely because of the contribution that women or girls will be making to the economy. So the same argument applies, but and putting women and girls together, you know, I remember when they were starting to do that at DFID, and there were a couple of people who had been my students originally, who now have lovely positions in DFID. One of them is an amazing Trinidadian woman who worked in Guayaquil with me. I used to, when I was at the bank, I used to bring over researchers who'd been on my master's programs, and they'd come and work for a while. And Alicia Herbert, she's done very, very well. And I remember when she was in the bank, was in DFID, and she had to start doing this, you know, girl stuff and women stuff. In DFID, it was entirely driven, I would say, off the record as we're having a chat, it was entirely driven by the economics, that they could get Nike to fund it all. And they were looking for a funder. And Nike liked the idea of girls and, you know, selling, you know, jogging, you know, these were the kids that were going to buy these wonderful Nike shoes. They're much more interested in them than they were in sort of middle-aged women who might not be jogging anymore, you know, and that's where it came from. But you can, and I've read a lot of the stuff on this when I was writing this the article on positionality. I became very interested in looking at it, and well, you know, it's again, it's picking up something, and you could say abusing it. But I mean, that's what a lot of the stuff on any of these issues is, and one has to be aware of them and know where they're going and know what they're doing. You know, and that's why, and I'm just come back to it as a caution. It's not that I don't agree about gender and climate at all. I think it's incredibly important, and it's not that I don't think that violence and climate is incredibly important. But I think understanding and really the robust research on what it really is, what is really going on there, is incredibly important. And the same on this issue. If it rolled out a lot of resources, so it allowed girls in schools in, you know, African countries to get more access to, you know, resources and so on, well and good. But I mean, the underpinnings of what the logic behind it is I think very problematic, and you know, so it's not as though things have all got a lot better. Anyway, that's a good question, Kamala.